So welcome to our first Eisenberg event of the new academic year. It's great to see so many people here. The last 2.5 years, as we all know, have been hard on everyone, and our ability to have any sort of intellectual and social community has been sorely tested. Although the reality of COVID remains, as sadly we all know, it is still great to see so many people gathered here to celebrate the continued possibility of collaborative discussion and engagement, as well as the intellectual riches that our dear colleague, Brian Porter-Szucs, will soon provide. For those who don't know me, my name is John Carson, and I am the new director of the Eisenberg Institute. Well, I got one vote of confidence anyway. Thank you. I would be remiss not to open this first event with a few well-deserved thank yous. First, I would like to thank History's chair, Angela Dillard, Associate Chair, Kit French, and the Executive Committee for inviting me to take up the directorship of the Institute. It is a real honor, and I only hope that I do their confidence some justice. Second, I need to thank the previous directors, particularly Ron Sooney, Howie Brick, Tony Tonomura, Hamid Pouf, and especially Mini Sinha, for providing support and advice as I slowly learn the ropes of being the director. They stand as amazing models of intellectual rigor and thoughtful leadership. Many deserve special gratitude from all of us, I believe. Leading the Institute through COVID was not what she or anyone would have signed up for, and she managed it with grace and resilience that I still marvel at. Third, I would like to thank Elizabeth Collins, our nearly indefatigable public engagement and events coordinator, and especially Greg Parker, right there, yes, who doesn't so much manage the Eisenberg Institute as run it and make sure that people like me get done what needs to happen. In addition, he keeps the coffee flowing and now has even added tea to his repertoire, which I am personally grateful. Finally, I would like to acknowledge something about where we are and how we have gotten here and at what costs. As many of us know, in the fall of 1817, a treaty was signed between Michigan's territorial governor, Lewis Cass, and the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Wendat, the Huron, whose ancestral lands include most of what is now Michigan's Lower Peninsula. In the treaty process, 1,920 acres of land were granted by the Native peoples for a college at Detroit, in which Native peoples would be eligible to enroll. To what degree it was a gift freely given or one coerced is still debated, but it constitutes the founding bequest for what became the University of Michigan and came with a clear obligation to provide education for the Native peoples in the state. According to the 2020 US Census, Native Americans represented 0.7% of Michigan's population. At however, in fall of 2021, out of the 50,278 students enrolled at the university, 83 were Native Americans, or 0.17%, 1/4 of the percentage of North Americans living in Michigan. I think we all know, could certainly do better. We should all push for that to happen in the future. Let me turn now to the main event. Inspired by Sheryl Lee Ralph's dazzling response on Sunday to winning an Emmy, in which she sang her acceptance speech, I momentarily considered doing the same thing this afternoon for our speaker. Luckily for everyone, the idea was fleeting, and so I will sing Brian's praises in a more conventional, and I am sure melodious form. Our speaker today, Brian Porter-Szucs, is well known probably to all of us. Currently the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of History, Brian arrived at Michigan in 1994, straight from his PhD work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He might well be the only faculty member in the department who did his undergraduate work at the University of Tulsa. And I am sure he is the only one who followed that up by spending 2 years in Poland at the University of Warsaw as a Fulbright Fellow. And at some point, it'd be interesting to know how that came about. Brian's career at Michigan has been exemplary, a productive scholar, more on that in a moment. Brian is also an innovative teacher and an excellent department citizen. A member of 31 dissertation committees and counting, and supervisor of 17 undergraduate senior honors theses. Brian's accomplishments in the classroom earned him the John Dewey Award for Outstanding Teaching in 2011, and his Thurnau Professorship in 2012. Thrice, Brian has been history's Director of Graduate Studies. And I might point out, where else but in a university could you get away with saying thrice? I thought this like thrice, I could use it here. He has also served as Director of Undergraduate Studies, member of History's Executive Committee, and President of the Polish Studies Association. The reason we are gathered here, however, is to partake of Brian's scholarship. Well, in addition to the reception at UMA right after the talk, to which you are all cordially invited. Brian is the author of 3 important monographs: When Nationalism Began to Hate, Imagining Modern Politics in 19th Century Poland, published in 2000, which won Best New Book Awards from both the Polish Institute for Arts and Sciences in America and the Polish Studies Association. Faith and Fatherland, Catholicism, Modernity, and Poland in 2011, which won the Kloszewski Prize for Best Book in Polish Studies. I hope I wasn't too far wrong with that. Close enough. Thank you, Brian. You're very generous. And my Polish is not so good. And most recently, Poland in the Modern World, Beyond Martyrdom in 2014, which he thoroughly revised and translated into Polish with a title I wouldn't even attempt to try to pronounce. Brian has also produced a long string of scholarly articles on aspects of Polish history, ranging from the nature of Polish nationalism, to Polish political culture, to Catholicism and anti-Semitism in Poland, to Polish economic thought and policies, about which I think we will hear more soon, as well as a number of interventions in more popular media in both the United States and Poland on issues of the moment. Like many faculty, Brian has the ability to address multiple kinds of audiences. He may be unique, however, in having an improv comedy group in Warsaw. Ask him to read excerpts of his latest book and then do sketches based on what he was reading. As Brian has explained, the humor that came from this interesting parallel of them performing his work relied on a disconnect between the actual lives of Poles today and the ways that they are typically taught to remember their history, and that Brian's book was attempting to dispel. It is this disconnect that is the subject of Brian's latest book and really much of his scholarly work, I think. Brian opens the English version, Poland in the Modern World, with the following. This is a book about a vaguely defined space in Northeastern Europe and the people who have lived there during the past 200 years. Most of them have usually, but not always, called themselves Poles. The country they lived in has usually, but not always, been called Poland. Neither the place nor the people are all that noteworthy in the grand scheme of things. Poland, Brian goes on to point out, is simply ordinary. Now, who in their right mind would begin a book by claiming that neither the place nor the people are particularly noteworthy? Doesn't Brian want to get people to buy the book and read it? There are a lot of pages there, and you presume they want them to go through it. The key, I think, lies in the joke about the man, lies in the jokes that were told in Warsaw. Brian wants to get away from the ways in which we are taught to remember the past, ways often part of one political project or another, and instead focus on how people, particularly everyday people, negotiated the worlds they encountered, lived lives as best they could, well, some of them anyway, and in the process, changed in ways big and small themselves and their communities. As I read him, Brian is deeply skeptical about what we might call flat or static histories, stories solely of triumph or tragedy, and particularly of stories where there is the presumption of some unchanging presence, be it the essential character of a nation or the existence of a universal and invariable homo economicus. Instead, Brian celebrates heterogeneity, multiple identities, personal and cultural evolution, contradictions, and the desire of most people simply to get on with life as best they can. Brian is as able as a next historian to make generalizations and to provide broad overviews. But routinely, he reminds his readers of the limits of such claims and of the diverse ways in which those we place into convenient racial, ethnic, religious, nationalistic groupings manage to contradict or push on or simply are indifferent to the supposed characteristics underlying the ways we are grouping them. The people, Brian remarks at one point in Poland in the Modern World, contained an irreducible diversity of views, desires, and complaints. Brian reminds us that identities are multiple and mutable, that they can come into sharp relief at one moment and then fade into the background at another. Poland may be ordinary, but in Brian's hands, it brings out in sharp relief one of the basic facts of life in the modern world. We live in societies that are dynamic, not static, that are composed of individuals who can be characterized by a multiplicity of identities and who are energized or weighed down by a diversity of interests, desires, and passions. Moreover, for Brian, heterogeneity and change are not to be lamented or considered as problems to be solved, but rather celebrated. Thus, it may be not so surprising that a comedy troupe would turn to Brian's history of Poland, because in a political situation where nationalist politicians insist on the homogeneity of the true Polish people and the centuries-long victimization of the nation, Brian's insistent that Poland just isn't that different from anywhere else, and that it is and always has been in its various incarnations a conglomeration of difference, can be seen as a welcome antidote to the nationalist visions being peddled by right-wing politicians. Brian doesn't like authoritarianism, in case you couldn't tell. He also doesn't like neoliberalism. He rejects both, I think, because each imagines that there is only one kind of person and one kind of truth, and because both are remarkably indifferent, if not simply hostile, to those who cannot or choose not to follow their dictates. Brian has written with great empathy and not a little wit about attempts in Poland to create something we might call market socialism. He is intrigued, I think, by the tensions between Western neoclassical economic thought and the attempts to fashion viable socialist alternatives, reminding his readers continually that at its core, capitalist economic man is envisioned as timeless, a product not of history, but simply a properly understood economic rationality. Instead, Brian argues, the consumer that we know today, whose unquenchable, we'll get it right, appetites are so vital to our economy, is a product of a specific conjuncture of social, cultural, and economic factors. I think we will learn much more about this as we hear Brian's Eisenberg lecture, Commodified Communism, Values and Prices in the Polish People's Republic. Brian, the lectern is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, John. I want to hear that guy speak. Unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to me instead. When I was invited to give this talk, I was also reminded that the theme for this year at the Eisenberg Institute is supposed to be against history. I'm interested to see as the year goes on what we end up meaning by that. But certainly I immediately could see how that wasn't too hard of a theme to fit into, given the sort of work I've been doing. I'm sure everybody in this room would shares with me the cringe when you hear anybody begin a sentence with, well, history shows that, we know that whatever comes next is going to be wrong, regardless of what is said. And that, I think, is particularly acute when we start talking about the socialist era in Poland. History shows that socialism does not work. Look at Poland. It didn't turn out so well. So it would seem, a place to look at that. It's become quite common, even for historians, maybe particularly for historians. Images like these, ration cards, that is ration card, and lines and empty shelves, all pictures taken from the 1980s in Poland, make it seem like you don't even have to make the argument. I mean, obviously, this is not a very effective and successful economy. There's even a popular board game well, I don't know how popular it is. There's a board game you can get in Poland. It's called Kolejka, which means the queue or the line. And it's you get to play a game of standing in line. I guess kids these days. The explicit point of the makers of the game is to show people show young people particularly what it was really like to live under socialism. It was really about standing in lines. These images are a bit misleading. They're not false, but they are misleading. I could just as well show pictures like these. And these are also from Poland in the 1980s. I was living there at the time. I saw these scenes, and I saw the other scenes too. I stood in those terrible lines, but I also went to these stores. The truth is, it was never just a picture of bleak gloom and doom and scarcity. Both existed. And I could show surveys like this one. This is from 2014. And they polled people who were old enough to remember what it was like prior to 1989 and just asked them how they assessed the Polish People's Republic. And as you can see, most people, not a huge majority, but most people viewed it positively. Or I could show you surveys like this one. This is from the 1980s. If anybody's interested, I can talk about the methodology of conducting a survey in a surveillance society with an authoritarian regime. It's very tricky, but actually there's good reason to trust these numbers. If you care, I can go into that, at least as rough ballpark. And as you can see, it was only in 1988, right before the fall, when you finally get to a situation where socialism loses majority support in Poland, right? Which a lot of Poles are themselves, a lot of Polish intellectuals are quite surprised to see this. And certainly the image of Poland as this nation of resistance against communist overlords kind of begins to be called into question when you look at numbers like this. Here, I think, is one of the reasons why those numbers are actually not so surprising. This is like my clincher chart that I've been challenged on a bunch of times, and I've gone back to the numbers a bunch of times, and this is solid. If we take 1948, which is the year that Poland had reached the levels of 1939, in other words, they recovered from the war in terms of like food consumption, any number of measures, food consumption, GDP, pick your metric. 48's a good year to say the war effects have been more or less recovered from. So we'll call that year one. 1990, the first full year of post-communist rule in Poland. So the first year of what we call the Third Republic. The PRL is the Polish People's Republic in Polish. And as you can see, no difference. There's really no difference. For 30 years, now I am stopping it at 30 years, first of all, because it's been 30 years since it happened. So the Third Republic only has 30 years. Also because then my figures for the PRL go after 30 years. So we won't have to look at that. But things are looking pretty bad in Poland right now, too. So it may well be that the Third Republic is also about to go over a cliff in terms of its economic performance, one way or the other. You don't get much of an argument. You don't get much of evidence here to support an argument either that socialism is a wonderful system to improve the productivity of an underdeveloped nation, or that socialism is an unmitigated disaster. Truthfully, it doesn't show up one way or the other. The performance is about the same. Most of the arguments that you get, if anybody even bothers to try to defend the claim that socialism was an utter failure, come from pointing out that the Polish People's Republic was much poorer than West Germany and France and the United States. Yes, it was. It was. It still is. And it was in 1930 and 1920 and 1870 and 1815. And we could go quite a ways back. It's really tough to make any generalizations that abstract from the relative position of Poland in the European hierarchies of of wealth and exclusion and marginalization. So does this mean that socialism was irrelevant for the economy of the People's Republic? Well, no, of course not. Far from it. In fact, it mattered a great deal that it was a socialist system, but it mattered in ways that don't have to do with aggregate economic success or aggregate economic failure, but has a lot to do with how things were distributed and managed and experienced. If we look outside of Poland, we get yet more evidence that generalizations are going to be really, really tricky here. Here I'm just taking a few years, 1948, 1988, and then 2018. And looking at all the various Soviet bloc countries. And what you can see is that you can't conclude anything. That some countries got closer to the European average during the experience of communism. Some fell further away. Some got closer after communism. Some fell further away. There's no pattern. All right. And I think that's actually really important in trying to give us a baseline for starting to talk about what socialism was actually like. So here's a really bad book. Hope he's like not a personal friend. Anyone here? This was a book came out in 1980 by a Hungarian economist, János Kornai, and it to this day has set the framework for how we talk about the economy of the socialist world. The economics of shortage. In this volume, Kornai explained why socialism inevitably produces shortages, which, when you think about it for, I guess, longer than most people have thought about it, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you take an Econ 101 class, one of the first things you'll learn is that the study of the economy is the study of the management of shortage or of scarcity. Every economy produces shortages. Socialism is by no means unique in that, by no means at all, but it does produce different types of shortages. That is important. Whereas socialism rations by a lot of different ways that I'll talk about in a minute, by queuing, by corruption, by networking, by a whole bunch of stuff. Capitalism rations by price. We all ration. It's whether the shortage is going to be a shortage of money or a shortage of goods. Stores in capitalism have abundant stuff, but that's just because people without the money don't go into the stores, and therefore there's no lines. This is quite obvious, I think. Socialism, in contrast, allows those shortages to be managed in a variety of ways. It becomes a policy choice that is made quite explicitly. Consider this. This comment. This is by this is from an academic conference in 1956, and somebody gave a presentation about why there needed to be some pricing reform. And from the audience came this this question. And it's like questions we're, I think, all too used to in this room. I really have more of a comment than a question. And he said this: one must not fetishize prices, price equilibrium. We must instead carry out a defined social policy. If we held price equilibrium as a fetish, then the only means of solving difficulties in meat supplies would be to raise the price of meat. Lines are unfortunate, but in some situations, they are the only solution if there isn't enough meat. Raising the price of meat is no solution for those who can't buy it at the higher price. And one of those things that the minute you say it, you realize, well, yeah, it's kind of obvious. But it does need to be said. It did need to be said at that moment. And this quotation brings me to the main point of my talk tonight and the main point of the book project that I'm currently working on. How the terms price and value, concepts of price and value, were conceptualized in socialist Poland, and how a change in this conceptualization, the debate over those terms right there, had enormous consequences, basically leading to the collapse of socialism itself in Poland. And what follows, I want to offer a really broad sort of flyover of the argument of the book without going into a whole bunch of detail, just to give you a presentation of the general line of thought here. I think it's worth reminding ourselves how the socialists themselves justified the policies they undertook. Everyone knows, of course, I think it's safe to say that the East Soviet bloc countries were centrally managed economies, centrally planned economies. I don't should tell you that. But I think few people outside the field, and actually few inside the field, give much thought to why that was so. Like, what were the arguments? Why did they want to have centralized economies? Why did they think that was a good idea? Why did they think that was itself important? I found when talking about these issues that people who know a lot about Marxist theory and talk a lot about Marx actually tend nowadays not to know so much or spend much time learning about the actually existing Soviet economies, probably on the assumption that, well, they failed, so they couldn't have been anything worth studying. And people who know the history of Eastern Europe and focus on the history of Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union really don't pay a whole lot of attention to Marxist theory. This wasn't always true. And in fact, it's embarrassing. A lot of what I say here, you could also find in any number of really good scholarly works from the 1960s or the 1950s. But even certainly, I think the generation of people born after 1989, we begin to see this divide in interests in Marxism. That you're either interested in Marxism or you're interested in the world of Eastern Europe, but not the two. And I want to kind of bring those together. In any case, I want to use my time today to do that. So, an old saying: price is what you get, price is what you pay, value is what you get. Now, everyone here, you all understand that. You know what that saying means. You know it because you aren't economists. This is obvious to you. Of course, there's a difference between price and value, obviously. Right? Well, to us, yes. Value is what something ought to cost. Value is a normative claim. Something should be worth something. It is what we believe. Or to use more the language of our department, it is culturally, historically, socially determined and contextualized. And that's how we figure out what value is. Value comes out of social relations and cultural norms. Prices, well, prices develop according to a somewhat different logic. And that distinction is something that has been lost in at least a certain segment of economic thought. I don't want to overgeneralize too far here, because there are certainly many non-mainstream economists, heterodox economists, who will be the first to acknowledge everything I'm saying. So I'm not trying to fish on the economists, although maybe a little, but certainly among a certain type of neoclassical economists. The rise of capitalism famously made it very hard to talk about unpriced value. It's very tricky to talk about that. This problem began with the classical economists, actually, even before. You can go back to Locke, and you can find his writing about intrinsic value versus marketable value as two different things. Adam Smith switched the noun and called them natural price versus market price. Marx famously, at least famously for this room, speaks of use value and exchange value. What all of these thinkers and many, many others from that sort of few generations of economic theorists were trying to do is to figure out a way to distinguish between two things that were becoming hard to differentiate in sort of European, well, can't really call it economic thought because the term hadn't been invented yet, political economy. With the rise of neoclassical economics in the late 19th century, with people like Marshall and Pareto and all those, basically the problem is solved by saying there is no problem. The problem is solved by saying that price is value, that price is determined by the equilibrium that is established in a free market exchange. Henceforth, true value of an item is what it would exchange for in a free market. And to speak of a value that exists outside of pricing is a nonsensical statement, at least within the neoclassical economic tradition. Taught to believe that things and people are worth what the market says they are worth. Alternative approaches to value are dismissed as either idiosyncratic preferences by individuals that get washed out in the mass of market exchange, or metaphysical matters that philosophers and theologians can talk about, but are of no concern to the scientific economist. Now, jumping ahead to trying to put socialism into practice and thinking about value. Just a brief detour to the Soviet Union, and Poland. It's something that a big argument that lasted for several generations, several decades, from the 1930s, 1940s into the 1950s, is called, even at the time, was called the law of value debate. I love this. I love this book. The nicely, very 1950s graphic styling makes it seem like this bright, inviting book. And then what must surely be the most boring title that has ever been put on a cover of a book before. Economists discuss the law of value. That just ran off the shelves. I'm very grateful for it, though, because it really is a very interesting text, which I may have some quotations from later. Anyway, to understand the debate, and pardon me if this is quite basic, but I just want to lay the groundwork. To understand the debate, it's helpful to recall the sort of intellectual framework by which the socialist economy was imagined by the people who were trying to run it. So they imagined, and they often use this metaphor, they imagined the country as a corporation. Let's just call it Poland Incorporated. So every large corporation, capitalist or socialist, has an internal accounting system based on a variety of forms of just keeping track of things, right? As goods proceed through an assembly line, one station does not demand that the next station pay for an item that is passing along the assembly line. You know, somebody in a factory, I'm actually stealing a line from David Graeber here. Somebody says, "Could you please pass me that hammer?" The coworker does not say, "What do you give me for it?" Right? That doesn't make any sense. No, there is no market economy within a firm, precisely because there's no commercial transaction going on. There's no change in property ownership going on. It's all part of the same thing. Okay, to understand the socialist economy, just keep in mind that that's what the country was, okay? This means that there was no wholesale trade in the socialist economy. There couldn't be, because it all had the same owner. From a course, a finance course, I spent a lot of time researching this book, reading transcripts of lectures and textbooks and syllabi. It was, not the most exciting research project, although I am interested in the results. But anyway, this is from a transcript of a lecture at a finance professor in Warsaw in 1953. He said this: "The state does not lose property rights through the process of production, since both the firm producing a given item and the firm receiving that item are the collective property of the nation. They all are." So in theory, one could do away with pricing altogether. Large firms, I just mentioned, don't have pricing, right, inside the firm. Pricing only begins when it leaves the firm. So you could say that instead of saying that a certain steel mill has to produce X zloty worth of steel, you could just say they have to produce X tons of steel. There's no reason why you couldn't do that in theory. Now, in practice, that created, in an era before widespread computer use, that created a lot of logistical challenges, to put it mildly. So even in, before the story gets to Poland in the Soviet Union, there's a recognition, and here, if you're interested, there's Kantorowicz, the famous Soviet economist, came up with a system of accounting that was supposed to be a socialist form of accounting that wouldn't need prices per se, although some have called them shadow prices. They were trying to come up with an idea of pricing. How can we think about pricing in a way that will allow us to maintain the socialist values that we have? The way they eventually did it is to create a type of price, but it wasn't a price like we mean in the West. And later neoclassical economists would be very derisive of this approach. I think unnecessarily so, actually. So here's the sort of foundational law for the way that worked in Poland, and each Soviet bloc country had a slightly different system. So they created two different types of companies in the 1950s. The so-called budgetary firms and the economic accounting firms. It's hard to translate because it's really clunky in Polish too. A different type of firm. So budgetary firms were centrally managed without any commodity mediation whatsoever. Right? If one division in such a firm needed something from another division, they simply ordered it and had it delivered. There's no attempt at creating any kind of commodity relation between them. Now, the second type included these economic accounting firms. They were individually administered as if they were separate entities, separate legal entities. They all are owned by Poland Incorporated, but they would be accounted for as if they weren't, right? And so if they needed a product, a supply, they had to pay for it. And you came up with a system of pricing so as to facilitate those transactions. We know how this works, actually. Anyone who has been around here, I'm not sure anyone who's been around here long enough, to remember when University of Michigan went on to a system of accounting, which allowed departments to have to manage their own budgets. It happened back in the 1990s. I forget what the buzzword was at the time. Value sentiment. Yeah, right. It's under, I think it was under Bollinger, or maybe his immediate predecessor. Anyway, so, as I remember well from stints as DGS, we owe Rackham money, right? We are treated as if we are a separate economic unit, and Rackham gives us money to pay for our graduate program. And when we enroll too many students, we then owe them money. Now, of course, it's all fiction, right? Because we're all, the money is, it's inside the University of Michigan. It's play money. Of course, we're not allowed to acknowledge that. We're not allowed to treat it that way. But in fact, the fungibility of it is real. It is fungible to a certain extent, depending on who's in charge at Rackham at any given moment. So we have to think about socialist economy as basically just one big University of Michigan. Maybe that's not the best metaphor I want to use to make the argument that it's potentially functional. Anyway, maybe don't push that metaphor too far. Okay. Anyway, in this system, prices are used as a method of accounting, and they have an importance as a method of accounting, but they are not market prices. They're not exchange prices, and they're not meant to be. It is never assumed that they must or even should necessarily correspond to any supply and demand equilibrium. So here's another lecture quotation from another lecture transcript. This is from the 1953-54 academic year at Poland's Main School for Planning and Statistics. And the professor said, "The profitability of particular firms and branches is subordinated to the profitability of the entire national economy. In a socialist economy, alongside profitable firms, there can also temporarily exist firms that are unprofitable, even firms that take losses, if they are very important to the national economy. The socialist state sustains those firms with state subsidies, taking measures aimed at making them profitable." Now, a great example of how this worked in practice on the ground is represented by an accounting concept called the cena rozliczeniowa. it translates as clearing price, but that term also exists within accounting in capitalist economies. It doesn't mean the same thing. So it's not the greatest translation, but it is literally the translation. And it is the term used now to mean the same thing as our accountants mean by clearing price. Anyway, so how does this work? So the clearing price is derived by taking the average cost it takes to produce a certain item throughout the economy, averaging from all the different firms that are making that particular good. As opposed to, for example, the specific costs it takes a specific firm to make that specific good. It's the industry average, we might say. That's the clearing price. When accounting for the production at any given factory, the price that mattered was the clearing price, not any kind of market price and not the literal costs of the local institution. And this mattered, and it wasn't as absurd as it might sound at first glance. We can see the significance of this, the way this worked out by an interesting moment. In 1947, the director of the Central Coal Mine Administration, a guy named Frederick Topolsky, went to some miners and was trying to explain to them how this worked. This is by then a very new system at the time. And he pointed out that this system is much better for the workers at the coal mine. Why? Well, he said that miners and workers in general had always been somewhat bewildered by the workings of market pricing, that they could work really hard. They could even potentially have really good managers. Everything could be doing just fine, and then the firm could nonetheless be closed down. Perhaps it was discovered that the same product could be made in another country at a cheaper price, or whatever. And the firm would just be closed down, despite the fact that they were producing good materials efficiently with hard work and good management. Nonetheless, they could lose. Well, Topolsky points out that can't happen in this system. This problem won't arise under socialism, thanks to the clearing price. He said, it was necessary to find some sort of solution that would, without violating the existing coal price tables, ensure for all economic units in the coal industry an equivalent profit. Such a solution is the concept of the clearing price. Thanks to it, firms that up until now had very high individual costs, despite having an efficient organization, could count on development and income. And in fact, going back to some of those charts I showed at the very beginning, this concept was in fact extremely effective at allowing for the development of very unprofitable, initially, industries in certain parts of the country where they hadn't existed before. So Topolsky was basically saying that profitability itself is a concept that can exist under one accounting structure and then vanish under another accounting structure, or vice versa. And so the framework of accounting itself could determine what profitability was. Profitability was not something that was simply out there in nature existing. Now, obviously, this system was far from ideal. It had a lot of problems. It created a lot of unintended side effects, some of which would become quite severe. It was rife, create a system that was rife with corruption, and lobbying became very, very important. It could go down a long list of ways in which this was suboptimal. But then again, so is the pricing and accounting system in a capitalist context, very suboptimal in many different ways. This system made it possible, at least, to approach any given firm holistically, to look at the complete package of things that you might want to value in the production of a given firm. It might be economically nonsensical, in fact, to close down a factory if you are using these pricing and accounting mechanisms, whereas it would be economically inevitable to close down that factory in a capitalist structure. And the way they would often mention this is talk about this is that they couldn't externalize costs. Capitalists externalize costs all the time. If there's environmental damage, the state takes care of it. right? If there's a need for a more educated workforce, the state takes care of it. There's another source, there's another entity that is conceptually separate that will take care of all these things. Well, they couldn't externalize anything. They could try, and they did try, but they failed. You couldn't really externalize anything. And you can imagine the way the scene would play out. You have a factory owner, manager, for example, who says that, who decides that one branch of the firm is just not profitable. It's just not working out. It's not going to work. He wants to close it down. Well, that factory manager is responsible to Poland Incorporated. Well, who else is responsible to Poland Incorporated? The local mayor, the local unemployment office, and social services departments, who are then going to have to deal with the fallout from the unemployment. The security services, who are going to have to be called in to put down any social unrest that happens when people are fired from their jobs. They're all employees of the same firm. And so you can't maximize profitability at the cost of something that's going to broadly affect the community. Now, this certainly meant that you couldn't maximize firm profitability, firm level profitability to this in the same way that capitalist firms could. So any individual socialist bloc firm set up against any individual capitalist firm will always lose, because the socialist bloc firm had to account for way more than any capitalist firm has to account for. And they had to use our language today. They had to respond to all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And that created a lot of inefficiencies according to capitalist accounting, but it also allowed in some ways for broader economic growth in the context of an underdeveloped economy. Now, this system lasted for several decades in the Soviet Union, not very long in Poland, because it only lasted until the end of the Stalinist era. Stalin died in 1953, and almost immediately in Poland, this whole system started to come under really harsh attack. First statement I found that started to criticize this system came from a little cluster of reform economists who wrote a joint letter to First Secretary Edward Ohab at the time, 6 prominent economists, and they complained about a long list of things. They complained about inefficiency, waste, lack of technological innovation, poor incentive structures, about, quote, bureaucratic nonsense. But the worst thing they said was, quote, "This state of affairs is not limited to transitional causes, but it is in fact related to causes of a structural nature." There's something deeper going on. They said, "We are firmly convinced that a fundamental change in the style of economic activity, the uekonomicznienie of that activity, should bring huge effects, uncovering countless reserves that we are now stamping down with our own feet." That's a hard to translate word. That's why I didn't try to translate it. It doesn't mean economize. It looks like it. In English, economize means to save, to be frugal. That's not what the word means. The word means account for in the way that economists do, basically. Think about it like an economist, to economize. So employing, other terms were used were economic metrics or economic accounting, as opposed to the whatever accounting they were using before. If we hear commodify, where they talk about economize, we wouldn't be far off, because that's what they're talking about doing. We need to commodify our world in ways that it currently is not. So writing in 1957, a prominent economist named Czesław Bobrowski wrote that he and his colleagues were mounting an attack on the economic policies of the past decade. Here's what he said. "Our attack was aimed simultaneously at 2 targets: the practice of constructing plans while ignoring economic criteria, economic accounting, and instead showing a tendency towards arbitrary, voluntaristic, administrative decisions." There's a really, really common set of antonyms here. You have economic thinking, and then you have, on the other side, arbitrary thinking. These are supposed to be the opposites. As well as conveying the planning tasks with administrative methods, another opposite to economic. You have economic or you have administrative. when it would have been possible to effectively use methods of economic influence, he really needs it. He really needs a synonym for economic here, doesn't he? On the firms assigned to realize the plan. The logical consequence of this attack on two fronts was the rehabilitation of the law of value on the one hand, and a firm acceptance of the thesis of the autonomy of the firm on the other. At first glance, a call for rigorous accounting measures sounds banal. Well, sure, we should keep better books. Okay, that's not what's going on here. To understand it, I'd like to quote an anthropologist, really great article by Martha Lamplin, a wonderful anthropologist of works on Hungary. She has this article where she makes this distinction between wrong numbers and false numbers. And I find this really useful to think with. Wrong numbers are mistaken. They might be deliberately manipulated. They might be the result of bad math or whatever. They're just wrong, right? And they're problematic. You have a wrong number is wrong in any given framework, and you don't want to have wrong numbers. But false numbers are more interesting. False numbers are sometimes necessary, but they're always tricky. They're always potentially problematic. False numbers are representations of reality with a number that we actually know aren't quite precise. All right? We know we really can't get the true number, but we'll come up with a number that we will use for our accounting purposes. It's actually very, very common in accounting, which is what Martha Lamplin studies. Well, I would argue that prices are always false numbers. Prices are always false numbers, whether it's capitalist or socialist context. The process of valuation, or rather, let me be more careful. Prices are always false numbers if you think that prices are a reflection of value. Understanding value as a socially constructed, historically contextualized, culturally dependent concept, prices do not reflect that. Maybe if you want to give neoclassical economists their due, they sometimes come close to it. Maybe. Oh yeah, I can raise this up. Maybe. But probably not even that. But they certainly are never exact representations of value in the sense that we all colloquially use the word value. And I think our colloquial use of the word value actually really matters quite a lot. There's a long tradition in socialist thought of thinking very seriously about history and about the way in which history constructs value. I'll have a quotation here from a prominent mid-century socialist that is, I think, will warm our hearts as historians. One of the distinguishing features of political economy is that its laws, unlike those of the natural sciences, are impermanent. That they, or at least the majority of them, operate for a definite historical period, after which they give place to new laws. It is said that economic laws are elemental in character, that their action is unavoidable and society is powerless against them. That is not true. It is making a fetish of laws and oneself the slave of laws. It has been demonstrated that society is not powerless against laws, that having come to know economic laws, relying upon them, society can restrict their sphere of action, utilize them in the interests of society and harness them, just as in the case of the forces of nature and their laws. Now, I haven't told you where this came from because I didn't want to sort of poison the well in advance. This is Comrade Stalin. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, in this case, he's actually saying something I think most of us as historians would agree with, that laws in the economy are socially constructed and that they are therefore mutable, right? And in fact, that is very much central to the way that initially the socialist economies were treating economic laws and pricing. Now, for a perspective against history, this point of view was really attacked as soon as the Stalinists fell from power. It was undermined and pretty much rejected. There was a very, I almost say exciting, but that would be an oxymoron, academic conference, interesting and noteworthy academic conference that happened, economists' academic conference, that happened in 1956, just before all the big events that made all the headlines in 56. This was in the summer. And it was suddenly all these economists come out of the woodwork and say, we really need to start bringing economic thinking into our planning process. One speaker repeated an old Marxist line saying that this is actually I never found the origin of this quotation, but it's really common, that bourgeois economists deal with the study of how people interact with things. Socialist economists deal with the way people interact with people. If anybody knows the origin of that quote, I'd love to know it. I don't know where it came from, but it was quoted, it's said all the time as if it was a quotation. So anyway, throughout that didn't go over so well when the speaker said that. So one speaker from the audience, a guy named Zbigniew Zakrzewski, very prominent economist. He was actually head of the Polish Economics Society in Poznań, a university professor there. He stood up and he said, no. The flaw of that definition of the subject of economics is also that instead of turning our attention to the usual strictly economic elements like prices, cost, income, money, etc., we accentuate social relations, losing that which is economic in the subject of the social sciences in its entirety. A particularly egregious error, Zakrzewski went on to say, was arguing that human relations changed over time. This is completely contrary to the nature of any good economic thinking, he said, because that would mean that economic laws cannot exist. People who advocated a historical approach, he said, were a danger to the profession of economics. And quoting again, cultivating their peculiar theory of stages, which justifies everything, they commit a grave offense to the science of economics, making people doubt the sincerity of the representatives of that science. The guy still called himself a Marxist. But, another speaker at that convention, very distinguished one actually, Edward Lipinski, who was he was the eminence grise of Polish economists at the time, one of the older members of the profession then, later become a major figure in the opposition movement, anti-communist opposition movement. He gave a paper that captured a very oft expressed desire to make economics scientific by transforming prices into a hard material reality. Capital, he said, is a social relation. As such, it does not contain within itself anything material, but capital is expressed in money, is a measurable quantity. It is tangible. It is a quantity that functions just like any other material quantity. Builders calculating the durability of material are working with the same material, quantifiable objects, as economists. The law of value governs prices. Market value constitutes the point of gravity for prices. But prices or changes in prices lead to automatic changes in supply and demand. They lead to a reaction that must be analyzed. This perspective led to the view, as another prominent economist, Bruce, put it, a price which does not lead to an equilibrium between supply and demand is fundamentally a price that is economically unjustified. If it is a lower price than the equilibrium price, it can be sustained only with administrative methods, a system of rationing, or at the cost of such phenomenon as hoarding or lines outside the shop. So Bruce is already taking it for granted that administrative methods, lines, rationing, are illegitimate by definition. Those are not policy options. They're just wrong. So throughout the history of the Polish People's Republic, the reform economists kind of lost every battle but won the war. And the way that worked out is actually really important. The views of Bruce, Lipinski, Bobrowski, the other people I've been quoting here, became almost completely hegemonic within the economics profession and in the halls of the planning office. And in the book, I have lots of examples and stories of various moments of policy decision-making. And you can see that this is the mindset that just absolutely was there already by the mid-60s, 1970s, right? Totally hegemonic. However, they then had to take these ideas and feed them to the politicians. And that's where the problems began. And not actually with the politicians themselves, who were often quite receptive. But the politicians, being politicians, were constrained to politics. And that mattered even in authoritarian countries. The question came, What do you do when you get charts like this, other than, start crying and run away? For example, this one. Nominal income growth over the course of the 1970s is in the brown line here, and then growth in the volume of available consumer goods is in the blue line. Doesn't look so good, right? What you're having is incomes are growing, but the availability of stuff to buy with that income is not. Right? Economists call this an inflationary overhang or monetary overhang. Or you have this one. This really freaked people out. This is a projection in the planning office from, I'm sorry, what year was it drawn up? 1980 was when they came up with this forecast. And their forecast is the shortfall between supply and demand in various types of consumer goods. And it's not very good. And they knew what was happening here, and they recognized it as a problem. Now, for someone like Bruce, and frankly, for almost all the economists who were active at that time, this is catastrophic. This is like really, really, really bad. And most importantly, there is only one possible way to deal with this. You raise the prices until the demand goes away. And then the problem is solved. Right? If you tried to impose price controls, you would have what they called hidden inflation. If you tried to have rationing, you would have rationing, and that we don't know. We don't do rationing. Well, they eventually did do rationing, but what is often forgotten is that rationing was introduced because it was one of the demands of the solidarity labor movement. The government wanted to raise prices and thereby eliminate the demand. If people are priced out of it because of a shortage of money, then there's no shortage. If there's merely a shortage of goods, well, then that's something we have to deal with. So solidarity labor activists, union activists, demanded ration cards. So that is not enough stuff to go around, so we must ration it. That's the only fair way to deal with it. So I am arguing that we should recognize that what to do with a monetary overhang, what to do when with the relationship between prices and the availability of goods is a policy choice, not an economic law. You have a choice. And this is actually quite relevant in our world at this very moment, right? There are policy choices to be made. You could raise prices, and that will certainly eliminate, quote unquote, the demand. It's not going to do anything, though, for the desire. It's just going to mean that a whole bunch of people are not even going to try to buy it, and therefore the demand will disappear. Yeah, by that logic. So explicit rationing was another way to deal with it, another policy option. Now, by that time, economists and everybody in the planning office was saying that is off the table from the beginning. We don't want to even think about that. There is only one policy we must pursue, and that is to use, this is not the term they use, but the term we would definitely use, austerity. We have to impose an austerity regime in the country. So the argument in my book tracks this story over the whole 40 years, and glossing over tons of detail here. But the grist of the argument is that the ideological shift I've described very briefly here was at the foundation of a gradual erosion in the intellectual foundation of socialism itself in Poland that dates from the 1950s. So that the socialist regime in Poland lasted maybe 10 years. And then it began to crumble. But it crumbled from within and not for the reasons that people think of. I try to show that the changes in the intellectual climate among professional economists and policy advisors changed the actual policies that were eventually pursued, particularly as we get to the late 1970s and the 1980s. The results were catastrophic because they generated intense grassroots resistance. The imposing of a shortage of money led to a lot of people being very, very unhappy. And you don't want to do that in Poland because they have a tendency to strike. And they did. And well, we know that story, right? That resistance to these policies toppled the Communist Party. And I would argue the one time I would think Poland actually is really, really important and not so ordinary is in 1989, when it was the first domino that started the dominoes that led to the fall of the East Bloc and the Soviet Union itself. And that this was not a movement this was not a resistance movement to socialism. It was a resistance to austerity, to socialist austerity, by people who made the argument that you could introduce capitalist, what neoclassical, let's call it. They definitely didn't use the word capitalist. You could use neoclassical pricing models, and as long as you had collective ownership of property, you were still socialist. You were fine. Well, you know what? They couldn't. They couldn't do that, because once you introduced the neoclassical pricing mechanisms, you created a certain logic that even if you do have collective ownership, was going to lead towards this view that could see only one solution to the problem. If pricing is at the core of your economic model, if equilibrium is the concept around which everything else flows, then, you know, for a hammer, everything is a nail. Every problem can only be solved through pricing mechanisms, more and more open pricing mechanisms. So it will establish the much desired equilibrium. Policies to do that sparked the solidarity movement. This wasn't capitalist, it was socialist. These were socially owned companies, but it was austerity, and it was neoclassical, absolutely. Because it was, I argue, because of an inherent tension within the idea of market socialism that just could not be made to exist. So nowadays, one often, and I'll conclude on this, nowadays one often hears on the left in Eastern Europe, particularly, people saying that, well, we could, if we had just had the wisdom to introduce a true free and open market socialism, then we could have made it all survive. I argue instead that actually they did that, not as nowhere near to the degree that that the advocates of this policy would have ever liked. The reformist economists were always frustrated that they weren't getting everything they wanted, but they got a lot of what they wanted. They got the core of what they wanted. They got a world in which you had an attempt to merge socialist values with capitalist prices, and it just didn't work. Thank you very much. So I'm sorry this took longer than I had anticipated, although I'm going to blame the wonderful introduction, which
wasn't price model.
That's right. I don't know what the demand is for an introduction. I'm not sure. Sure, I can just handle my own. Yeah.
Open.
Yeah.
A really small question and a really big question. So, sorry. So I have a really small question and a really big one. The small one is, did I read your chart right? That they were projecting, the one on the last slide, they were projecting that typewriters would be the thing that was most. Is that?
That's a long story. Yeah, you just couldn't get a typewriter. And I have no idea why.
Okay. So yeah, that's really interesting. And that also, it's also interesting that they're not including things like food and clothing.
Oh, no, because I actually have a section in the book where I look at food supplies. And there is a moment in the early 1980s when everything really does collapse. And then you actually are having shortages of key food supplies. Interestingly, though, if you look at the public health data, there's no uptake, no increase in mortality. There's no increase in hospitalizations of nutrition-adjacent diseases. There's no decrease in height of young people who were teenagers at those years. In other words, there's no measurable effect of the shortages of food, because what happened was, first of all, it didn't last very long. It was only a few years. And second of all, it was a set of shortages that allowed for very easy substitutions. So I don't want to, it really sucked. I was living there at the time, and you never went to the grocery store with a shopping list. That was stupid. you couldn't ever get what you expected. It was really frustrating. But you never went hungry. And so shortages of food in that aggregate sense were a much less acute problem. Shortages of meat were a problem. That was an issue. I don't have that chart here, but that one was an issue they looked at. What's the big question?
Oh, so the big one is, how do you compare this to other socialist economies? Like it seems like isn't what the economists wanted to do? Isn't that what China did? Or am I just really ignorant? And
No.
the way they did it was just brute force and more.
So yeah, so there's a great book, a new book came out last year by an economist named Isabella Weber, who actually looks at this in great detail, and it's really very magnificent. And I'm saying that because she demonstrates how important Poland was to the Chinese reformists. That a whole bunch of these really prominent Polish economists were going over to China in the 1980s and telling them what they needed to do, and they eventually. This is interesting though, because they after much debate, the Chinese authorities concluded that would be stupid. If we impose radical austerity measures in order to suppress demand through pricing, that is going to lead to massive social unrest, and it might threaten our regime. Probably would threaten yours too. So in fact, what happened in China was not. They did begin to introduce more economic pricing, but in a very, very gradual and drawn out way. With the ongoing, even today, existence of many sort of asterisks where market pricing does not apply. So I'd say that what they learned from Poles is don't do that if you want to maintain power. And also, shoot anybody who tries to challenge your regime, but that's another question. So yeah, they didn't. In the other socialist countries, so there was two clusters of economists, the Poles and the Hungarians, who were spreading the gospel of neoclassical economics all around the East Bloc. They were listened to varying degrees. The one country where they got the most receptive audience was Ceausescu's Romania, where Ceausescu decided in 1980 that he indeed was going to do this. He was going to balance the books, clear his debt through a program of austerity, and he did. And it plunged Romania into an economic catastrophe that, my Polish friends would always say at the time, I love going to Romania. First of all, they have beautiful coasts, lovely beaches, and it's the only place in Europe where I can feel rich. Yeah, that's because of those policies. Soviets did a little bit of this as well, but they had other things they had to worry about by the 1980s. But Poland was unique in one important way. Unique. Poland and Romania. Those were the only two places where this went from being a problem into being a crisis. Those are the two countries where the economy really just collapsed. But that had to do, and this is a whole other talk, but that had to do with something that had nothing to do with Eastern Europe or socialism at all, but something that you know all too well about. What happens to countries that borrow a lot of money in the 1970s and 80s. Right there, what happened in Poland is exactly parallel to what happened in most of Latin America with the debt crisis, and that created the crisis that they then felt they had to deal with through austerity policies.
Hi, Brian. Thank you very much for this talk, which was so fascinating in so many ways. You just partly answered my question, but I'm gonna pose it anyway. I don't think I fully understood the reasons why classical economics kind of won in the 1950s. Why was it that in the immediate aftermath of the Stalinist period that suddenly this sort of neoclassical model of economics took off the way that it did and was so successful at convincing the economics establishment and the administrators of the Polish economy, and now, as you just said in your response to Suan, also in other parts of the Eastern Bloc. That's one question. given this, the success, I mean, I find this sort of, this description you have of market socialism so fascinating. Why is it that the memory of the market aspects of that socialism have been so completely forgotten, and that the austerity is associated with the socialism rather than the market side of the?
Yeah, no, good. Big question. The first question is that really is a question that takes us into the realm of intellectual history, or the sort of the networking of ideas. We're talking about a relatively small community of professionals here in the 1950s. You know, a few hundred people really, who really make this push. And this is something very different from the Soviet Union. These are people who just not long before had been, you know, Oscar Lange in 1936 was teaching here. He was actually I would like to bring that just for one semester. He was really at the University of Chicago, but he did come here. And he was one of the spearheads of this. A lot of these people they had lots of contacts. Oskar Kalecki, a name that is nowadays enjoying a great renaissance among heterodox economists. Another big Polish figure. He was a good friend of Keynes, and you know, they had these networks, right? And they were participating very much in the international trends within the discipline of economics. And so this is a moment in the history of the discipline of economics where neoclassicism is really just barreling forward full force. You know, this is when Paul Samuelson's textbook on economics is being taught like everywhere. And that's sort of what they call the synthesis of neoclassicism and Keynesianism, meaning the jettison of Keynesianism, was taking over American universities and British universities and Polish universities. That's that story. So
survived transition.
Yes, yeah, precisely because it wasn't that long. Right, these are, and you know, Lange, for example, if you look back to the 1930s, Lange engages in a whole bunch of really fascinating polemics with Hayek and von Mises about the feasibility of socialism. Really interesting to reread those today, and he does it by proposing a market socialism, and he carries that into Poland, renounces everything he said because the alternative was losing his job. In Poland, they weren't disappearing people in quite the same way they did in the Soviet Union, but he would have lost his job and he would have lost his status and position. So he renounced his former beliefs temporarily. And then as soon as the Stalinists fell, he came back and said them again, what he had always really believed in. And we have enough evidence to show that there is real continuity from, you know, up until 45, pause, and then ongoing above these people in this international network of economists. And I'm sorry, what was this?
Why the market side is for?
Oh, right. Well, I don't have a good answer for that. I think a lot of it has to do with the politics of the union movement was what brought down the Communist Party. Now that's kind of like, you know, should make your head explode. Right, that the union movement in Poland was anti-socialist, and it was in fact quite skeptical about like workers too. They didn't want to have anything the party said, any of the rhetorical weaponry of the Polish Communist Party. That was the enemy, and the slogans of market socialism, those were not being used, not by the party officials. Because there were factions in the party who didn't like that. So that's Yugoslavia, we don't do that. And so the rhetoric of market socialism in the 80s was not used, except by the economists themselves, but not by the politicians. So the movement to the mass movement that led to the dethroning of the communists was one that there just was nothing, there was not an enemy labeled market socialism. There was just an enemy labeled socialism. And so that was bad. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Thanks. thinking like in terms of macroeconomics and geopolitics, I guess, something that's always interested me in thinking about the early Soviet Union is this, imperative to export grains and buy steel and manufacturing equipment and stuff. And so I guess I was just thinking, in what ways does this kind of, does like price on the international market have trickle down effects through the Soviet Union into Russia? I mean, first with grain, but then with oil, right? Like at the end of the day, they're selling stuff to get the money to make stuff. And so, how do those price? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Yeah. So this gets back to my answer to Sue-Ann's question about the debt crisis, and what was in fact this is a whole chapter in the book, the moment when a policy decision was made that brought the whole house of cards down was when the Garrick regime in 1970 decided that it would be really smart to take advantage of low interest rates and high coal prices. Poland has a lot of coal, to borrow a lot of money to buy fancy new equipment, which could then be sold, and that the money from the sales would be able to repay the loan. They weren't thinking in terms of, I don't know about the Soviet case here, but I know in Poland, they weren't thinking in terms of embedding themselves within a capitalist market. International trade, they weren't saying, let's make international trade the center point of our, let's do what they would call an export-driven growth strategy. That was not what they were doing. What they were trying to do is get some technology. And they wanted to borrow money for licensing and for buying fancy machine tools. They borrowed a lot, and then the oil crisis hit. And that Poland does not have oil. That's something they had to buy on the international market, and it was just enormous. It just crippled the trade balance. And the Soviets did sell them slightly subsidized oil, and they always wanted to be thanked for that. Because it was cheaper than on the international market, but it was still very expensive, and much more than Poland could afford. And it just so happened that coal prices collapsed, and copper prices. Poland's also a huge exporter of copper. Copper prices. In this same report about the loan plan, they said even if the coal pricing doesn't play out, we're okay, because there's only 3 or 4 places in the world that have really good copper supplies. And they are several third world countries and us. And we are, of course, politically stable, and they are not. And so we will, with all these new electronic stuff that the West is developing, they're going to need to buy a lot of copper. And so we are absolutely safe. We'll always have a market for our copper. But of course, the oil crisis led to a massive recession in the capitalist world. And so suddenly nobody was buying anything. And so there are reasons even beyond this, but this was the moment dealing with these international trade issues where Poland ended up with this massive debt that then was crippling. But the key, and this is the direct answer to your question, is that they were not thinking in terms of starting an export-driven growth strategy. My understanding is that in the early Soviet Union, there was some talk about an export-driven growth strategy. So these are different cases. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure, Dario.
Thank you, Brian. It's so provocative. I have so many questions, but I can only ask a couple. So, I mean, no, only one. I'm going to be good, although I have so many. But so, one sentence in your talk really struck me, right? And it is really interesting. So the idea that the true socialist methodologies of the 1950s before.
I don't really want to say true socialist.
I know, but I mean, whatever. So that they actually had, if I understand it correctly, right? There is an element of, so they actually had a more holistic understanding, right? And so, and you, in your talk, if I understand correctly, right, you convey this more holistic understanding of price by saying that they did not so their prices internalized more of what in a market economy tends to be. So, and I found that so interesting, right? I mean, and in a sense, right, what is it that what was it that they internalized in those prices? If I can I ask you that. So, for example, I'm thinking about the ways in which, indeed, I mean, we fail to internalize costs, social costs in capitalist prices, and the cost of gas, right, is the in the United States is the most classic, classical example of that. And I want gas prices to go up, of course. The problem is that has hugely regressive consequences, right? Because clearly poor people can afford to buy gas, and far less than say we can, or university professors can, and so on. And so what I'm asking you to, I mean, I guess I'm just asking what they actually internalized and how they dealt with the externalities of the internalization, so to speak. I mean, in a society that is actually profoundly unequal, right? I mean, and it still is. So that's one of the questions I have for you, but I mean, I have 1,000.
The more I work through this material, the more I'm convinced that the single most important difference between actually existing socialism and actually existing capitalism, not the theories, but the actual functioning of these economies, is the fact that capitalism is extremely efficient at externalizing costs that producers do not want to have to pay for, and that socialism is really bad at that. Which, like I said, means that they will always lose in international competition, and they will be on a firm level inefficient. Because this is how it worked in practice. It worked in practice that okay, I'm going to build a new factory in this town, and this is a period of rapid industrialization. So population is skyrocketing, economic growth. The factories are going up like mushrooms after the rain. That's a Polish expression. Well, there's no housing there. Okay, we'll build the housing. There's no school. Okay, we'll build a school. Our workers are unhappy. Okay, we'll buy a little piece of property on the Baltic coast, and they can go and have vacation there, and we'll subsidize that, and then our workers can be happy. Everything becomes part of the calculation. And even when they would,
Some choice.
Well, yeah, I mean they would, but what the choice is, though, and this is the key thing. This is the key thing. Yes, the choices would be made. The choices would be made by the state, right? Who is the owner of all of it. And when I say all of it, I'm not just meaning all of the economic stuff. This is, again, we are so accustomed to thinking of there's the economy over here, and then there's the social stuff over here, and there's the political stuff over here. But this is all really the same thing, right? And the state is in a position where it must pay attention to all of these things. I'm not trying to say that these are, I'm not trying to idealize the system, because part of that was, well, let's make sure we have a nice, strong police force so we can put down all the unrest, and we have plenty of prisons to put the malcontents in. And, so it's not all, butterflies and rainbows, but it is a system where somebody at some point in the nomenclatura is going to have to say, wait a minute, if you make that decision, then there's going to be a consequence, and this person in that office is going to have to deal with it, and then they're going to come screaming at me, and so I'm going to bring both of you in, and we'll talk about it, and we'll figure out how to make this thing work. So it's not like there was some great system of holistic economic planning. It broke down at every step because it was, it was inefficient, and it was bureaucratic, and bureaucracies are not great. But the mechanism was there so that literally everything. No, I really do mean everything. I mean, are they going to be bored? We'll build a movie theater. That means, okay, we're going to have to make sure there are movies. So we're going to have to fund and subsidize Polish language movies, since we have a small market in the world. I mean, literally everything. You cannot externalize anything at all.
So pollution.
Now that's interesting. So pollution, yeah. So, this is where they tried hard to externalize pollution, and they did it through fraud and corruption. But that's the point. Even they saw it as fraud and corruption. So when it was discovered that some firm was illegally dumping their waste into a river, then either somebody would be bribed and it would be covered up, or it would be discovered, and then whoever was responsible would be, somehow disciplined. It wouldn't make the news, but you see it in the Central Committee discussions that I've been reading through. There are a lot of conversations about so and so is just ruining Silesia with all the pollution. We got to do something about this, and then they never manage it because there's so much corruption. But they see it as a problem, right? So it's a flawed system working within an ideology that ultimately permits no externalization, unless you can buy off all the right people, and that gets tricky.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
This is really fascinating, and as Dario said, brings up so many questions. And I just had one, but I want to switch to another maybe, which is related. I mean, it has to do with, there are prices, right, in the system. You talk about raising prices low. And so there are ways in which they are making decisions, and that some people are able to buy more than others, because I do explain in other places, people are not paid all the same. They're paid at different things. So there is a market kind of economy existing even in the earlier system, or even with a system that might also move to rationing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but also about the ways in which, I mean, if pricing is also about decision making, like we're going to put things here and there. And clearly the socialist planners in the various ways had to make a decision, build it in that place or build it somewhere else where maybe the overall costs in that, even in a highly externalized mode, would be less. But that involves also being able to weigh things that, are they weighing them on one metric of money? Are they weighing it on who's going to give the most? I mean, when you're putting together all those different things, right? Dollars become one, or money of one sort becomes one way of making comparisons of things that are difficult to compare. So I'm wondering what way they made commensurations within a system where they were looking at so many different kinds of externalities, which don't necessarily commensurate equally or easily.
Yeah. No, this is what threw all the economists into their conniption pits. They wanted that one metric of universal comparability, and the system didn't provide that. The real currency in the Polish People's Republic was not the Polish zloty, was not the actual currency. It was social bonds. It was an extremely socially embedded system, where how much money you had certainly mattered, because there were consumer prices and you got more stuff if you had an higher income, of course. But what really mattered is who you knew. And so, the most important economic activity was to go to a party. Not the worst system in the world. It led to certain, problems with alcohol consumption, unfortunately. But socializing was an economic act, because it would establish social bonds that then that was currency. And so when we come to making these decisions about where will we locate this new factory, will we locate it where it will be the most economically efficient in the way the economists want us to think, or where the person who has lobbied me the most effectively wants it, right? So again, I'm not idealizing the system, right? It led to bizarre decisions sometimes, but they were not. They were themselves decisions which were socially embedded in a very clientelistic set of social relationships that was not entirely divorced from politics, and the politics could never be entirely divorced from popular sentiment. And so it was something they had to think about. Like, this community is showing a lot of social unrest. We're getting the reports from the security services. Well, let's put a factory there, right? That would be a factor. So, this is not like democratic in any way we would think of it, but it's the way in which the social embeddedness manifests itself as the real currency. Now, as to the role that money then and pricing for consumer goods played, this gets us back to that whole debate over that law of value. Actually, in the Soviet Union, more even in the 30s and 40s, There were two places in every single socialist country, regardless of all the differentiation, where there were commodities. And you couldn't get away from it. There were commodities that were priced, that had to be priced. And that was when, you had to price something whenever property ownership changed. Okay. So wholesale pricing, that's not happening, right? If everything is owned by the same entity. But retail pricing, right? No one, to my knowledge, no one in anywhere in the Soviet bloc ever suggested collective ownership of personal property, right? You could have your own, you could have your own car, you could have your own TV set, you could have your own clothes. It was not that kind of communism, right? It was definitely a system in which individual personal property was a commodity. It left the property ownership of the state and went to the property ownership of an individual. Well, those things were priced with commodity pricing, right, from the start, because that was an actual commodity. The other case, which was huge in Poland, smaller in the Soviet Union, but even they're relevant, were the collective farms. And in Poland, private agriculture. So there in the Soviet Union, there were two types of collective farms. There were state-owned farms, and those just worked like any other state-owned factory. And so there, no commodity pricing, at least in theory. And there were collective farms, which in practice, they were pretty much the same thing. But in theory, they were owned by the farmers who lived on the collective farm. And that was created, maybe this mattered nothing at all in practice. I don't know enough about Soviet history to say. It certainly didn't matter much. But theoretically, when they started talking about this stuff, it mattered a lot, because that meant that farm, the kolkhoz, was a different economic entity than the state, grocery store. And so there was a transfer of property. And so you had commodity pricing that existed there from the start as well. So this type of pricing was never, it was treated as the baseline price in those type of exchanges was supposed to be something vaguely related to the market, but then with all sorts of political interventions coming in over top to make sure that anything that was deemed essential would be accessible to everybody. And so that for all essential goods, you weren't supposed to ever be prohibited by price, just by availability. And then they would argue a lot in the planning offices, what is an essential good? I have a chapter on this. What is the difference between a desire and a need? Which in a rapidly developing economy is a really tricky question to answer. Because what is a need in 1945 is food and, a roof. But what is a need in 1960, it's starting to get to be a TV. And so this is really, really tricky. And so they would have these long debates about should we classify this as a need or is this just a desire? And if it's a desire, you're going to use market price because that's fine. Who cares? But if it's a need, well, then you don't want to use market pricing. And so I guess typewriters were becoming a need.
Typewriters.
Yeah, typewriters. No, TVs are green. TVs are here. The TVs weren't so bad. Color TVs is another question. But TVs were by oh gosh, I don't remember. I think it's by 1970 something. Pretty much, you look at the spread of television. Pretty much every household had a TV. Yeah. Oh, and then go to that side. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I want to go back to Josh Cole's question, which is what in the end, how do you explain the appeal of neoclassical economics in Poland, right? So they had an international network, but there seems to be something more, right? This promise of economics as a science, but it does create this ideological block within socialism that is inimical to it. And why is that? Why do these economists have power? Why do politicians listen to them? Why do they believe that it's a science? I mean, it's a psychological question, but there seems to be something to explain there.
Why don't we take, yeah, exactly. Take this.
Sorry, just very quickly, because my question was really related to this. Don't you think that this shift in the role of prices from a kind of distributive allocative to a different role of prices after this post-Stalinist period has actually something to do with different values associated with socialism? Maybe there's a shift in socialism, certainly in Poland in the 60s, related to questions of innovation, related to they were really rethinking the relationship between the individual and the collective, for example, around questions of responsibility.
Yes.
So I was wondering whether really your core idea, values versus prices, whether that's
That there's a change in
useful to
values.
understand the prices change.
Absolutely.
So my question was asking you to postulate something around the idea that the state is a firm. And so we're seeing a large number of larger firms emerge that are actually pretty efficient, in large part thanks to very quick information cycles and information flows. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on running a socialist state in today's day and age, today's technology. Would it have gone further, and what, like, and we have maybe an example of one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was just curious to get your thoughts on that.
So it's the, I as a historian, I'm not even supposed to answer that question, right? Although I will answer it in a historian's way. And that is to say that the concept of cybernetics was hugely popular in Poland. I mentioned Oscar Lange's name, who gained international fame with his theories of cybernetics. Or if you like fiction, Stanisław Lem's fiction, he talks about cybernetics. And there was a lot of science fiction speculation and actual like serious social management talk about how once we get these computers everybody is promising, we'll be able to do this. Unfortunately, we can't since we can't even get a typewriter, we're doing this longhand, the just-in-time delivery systems and everything. But if you gave the planning office of Poland the computer infrastructure of Amazon, the results would be very different. I mean, that much I think I can say. Absolutely right about the values question. Although what I would say is that that is the huge blind spot of these reform economists. When you really dig into what they were saying in the 1950s, they were not part of someone like Edward Lipinski, a few of them overlap, but there's a real divide between the professional economists and the more humanistically oriented intelligentsia, right? And they sometimes go to the same parties, but they're not really the same communities, not entirely. And one of the things that really makes them distinct, and you see this by the late 1970s in some of the debates among opposition activists, I think you begin to see this very clearly, is discussion over the value of the person. With Catholic personalism becoming extremely popular in, I guess, what we'd call by then post-socialist dissident circles, leading to a very different system of values that does have its origins in the Communism and other groups from the 1950s. And you can trace an intellectual development there from the church, from the intellectuals, humanist intellectuals, leading up to someone like, I don't know, like Jacek Kuron or somebody like that. They weren't talking to the economists. The economists were moving from a very different sort of philosophical framework. And theirs was one of homework. They were absolutely not participating in either the Catholic discussions of personhood or the secular intelligentsia discussions of civil rights. They were participating in a conversation about rationale. It's why would that be compelling? Well, it wasn't compelling for most people. I mean, that's the thing. If you ask, you ask most of the members of the sort of intelligentsia opposition from that time, what were your opinions on Balcerovich's economic plans in the early 1980s? And they would say, what? Even when shock therapy was introduced, the They would say, I didn't quite understand it. You know, I'm just a humanist. I can't possibly understand its numbers. They're scary. You know, there's that is the appeal for the economists, because they developed a vocabulary which was totally impenetrable to anybody outside their circle. And this worked within the world of the Polish intelligentsia to give them a sort of credibility as a separate subgroup, that their popularity didn't matter because they had science. And so when the time came in 1989, they could use this. And even though what they were proposing with shock therapy went absolutely against the values of the opposition intelligentsia as they had been expressed for the last 20 or 30 years, they got accepted because they were science.
Yeah. So one more reminder to please come over to the apps in UMA for a lovely reception, but let's conclude by thanking Brian for a brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.